everybody's doing okay. Welcome. Good morning. Glad to see everybody. I know it's spring break. Last service, I just kept being surprised every time somebody showed up because it's like 9:30 in the morning on spring break Sunday. And then I said to somebody, I said, hey, you made it, and it's spring break. And they looked at me like, it is? Because I realized, like, oh, if you don't have kids, that makes no. It's just a regular day. Like, not everybody's life revolves around when school is and isn't happening. So I had to. It was a good reality check for me that not everybody lives in the same in the same like parental world as everybody else does. I see a lot of green also because it turns out it's St. Patrick's Day. I have no green on. I didn't have anything green to wear. Also, I had this realization this morning, like, hey, you can't make me perform an ethnicity that isn't necessarily even my ethnicity, under threat of violence, by the way, because my kids have told me that they're going to pinch me, and I said that's unacceptable. We're not doing that. So anyway, everybody who's wearing green, you look great, but I'm not going to play that sick game. I decided because I had nothing to wear. Anyway, this is neither here nor there. It has nothing to do with the sermon. I'm just trying to not feel super uncomfortable being up here with a microphone. So anyway, we are in the middle of this series that we've been doing on the 8 miracles in the book of John. So the book of John, if you've been following along, you've been told many times now at this point that the book of John is structured in such a way to where it is meant to mirror the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1. In fact, I didn't even mention this the first time we did this, but the opening line of the book of John is, in the beginning was the Word, which is a mirror of the opening of Genesis. And so the whole book of John is trying to structure itself as if to say there is a new creation. And so there are these 8 miracles, and the 8th miracle being the resurrection of Jesus, which we will get to on Easter. And so you have these other 7 miracles that are supposed to mirror the 7 days of creation that sort of build up to a new creation and a new story. So it's almost like John is trying to say, yeah, there is a new story being told, but it's actually embedded inside of this very old story that we've all been telling each other for thousands and thousands of years. So that's what we've been doing with this series. So some of the miracles that we look at are very helpful. Like the last couple of weeks, there have been some sort of healing event, like somebody who couldn't walk can heal or can walk. Somebody who was sick isn't sick anymore. Even the first one that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, where Jesus turns water into wine. You know, there's an awkward beverage situation that is remedied at a wedding, which is not the most important thing to have happen, but it's helpful at some level. But today we're going to be looking specifically at the miracle where Jesus walks on water, which I would argue is the least helpful of any of the miracles. It's more show-offy, I would argue, than the rest of them. It's like, well, these other ones have helped other people quite a bit. This one is just like, well, I missed my ride, and so I guess I better walk. And so it's not as like, oh, thank goodness he was able to do that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to X, Y, Z. No, it's just a thing that happens. And so it becomes a question of like, well, what are we supposed to do with this? How what is Jesus trying to do other than just to like catch up to his ride? And so there becomes sort of a question of like, is this a useful story? Is there anything to gain from this particular story? And so I'm setting that up here a little bit, saying like, yeah, in a few minutes, we're going to look at the story in John where Jesus walks on water. However, before we look at that story, we have to look at a completely different story. And because to understand the story of Jesus walking on water and to understand what it would have meant to the people who first heard this story, we have to look at a different story. So we have to look at the story, specifically the story that defined the Jewish people of Jesus' day, but arguably up to this point, because we're going to be looking at the story of the Exodus, which to this day, if you attend a Jewish synagogue, you will hear remnants of this story almost every week probably, because this is the defining story in the life of the Hebrew people. And so John, it's helpful to understand, is a Jewish writer in the ancient Near East, in the Judean area, writing to a group of Jewish readers. And so specifically, and we've talked about this a few times already, so some of this may be review, but one of the things that's happened, I would argue the defining thing that has happened to the group of people who are receiving John's letter in somewhere after the year 70 CE is in the year 70, which again, we talked about a couple of times, there was the sacking of Jerusalem, which was basically an attempt by the Roman, a very successful attempt, I might add, to push down a rebellion in the city of Jerusalem. And so the Roman emperor at the time is a guy named Vespasian, and the general that he sent is a guy named Titus, who would later become the emperor. And so Titus goes in and tells his men to, when it comes to the temple specifically, he says, leave no brick standing on top of another brick. In other words, leave the whole thing devastated. They kill over 100,000 people. They destroy homes. They destroy businesses. They kill lots of people, and they destroy the temple. Basically, as an attempt to say, if anybody has any thoughts of rebellion after today, that just know this is what happens. So you have this group of people living in the aftermath of this, and they are devastated. And by the way, in this time and in this place, if you have a group of people who worship a specific God and the temple to that God is destroyed, the belief is that God is no longer here, that God is no longer with us in any sort of way because there is no temple for us to connect with that God. So it's not just like we made it harder for them to practice their religion. It is we took away their religion. We took away their faith. We took away their sense of community and identity in a very definitive, very real kind of way. So all the people who are reading John's story are living through this, but also these are Jewish people with a deeply Jewish sensibility. So all the things that John makes reference to could be traced back to ancient Jewish texts, which is what we're going to look at. So before we look at the story of Jesus walking on water, we have to go back and look at the story of the Exodus. And so we're going to do the entire book of Exodus in about 5 minutes. So hold on. I'm going to have to talk fast, which is not unusual, but I'm going to have to do it anyway. So first of all, we have to understand, you have this guy named Moses. And Moses is living in Egypt. And Moses is a Hebrew, but Moses has sort of been elevated outside of regular Hebrew status because all the other Hebrews living in Egypt are enslaved. And so for 400 years up to this point, you have this group of people who have been enslaved by the Egyptian people. And at a certain point, Moses decides, I've had enough. I can't take it anymore. And so Moses has an encounter with God. And God speaks to Moses very famously through a burning bush. And so in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, or basically what's going on in this conversation is God is saying to Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt and liberate my people from slavery. And so in Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, it says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? And Pharaoh is just the word for king, the Egyptian king. And so it says, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? Now, this is a completely legitimate question at this time and in this place, because in the Egyptian world, and in most ancient civilizations, there was no sense of monotheism, which is to say there were no cultures that only worshipped one God. Every culture at this time had a multiple God kind of system, including and especially really the Egyptians. And so if you have people who have lived in Egypt for 400 years and you go to those people and say, God has sent me to liberate you, they would be like, okay, which one? You know what I mean? Like, is it the God of the sun? Is it the God of the sea? Is it the God of the farm? Is it the God of rain? Which God specifically is interested in our liberation? Because we've been here for 400 years, and none of these gods have come to help us so far. And so Moses is saying, which God do I tell them has sent me to do this? And so God says to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you, which at face value feels deeply unhelpful. Do you have like a nickname? Is there is there other stuff I can say that will be a little bit less vague and more convincing than I am has sent me to you? But here's the thing about this. When this God says to Moses, I am has sent you, it's a very specific phrase in ancient Hebrew, and it's this idea of it is a present tense, first person noun, I, and then a present tense verb. And so I am it's a very specific wording. It's basically a way of saying this. I'm not being vague, and I'm not trying to give you a name that doesn't really sound like a name. What this God is saying is, I am the ever-sustaining force of the cosmos. The gods that you are used to, I am not that God. I am a different kind of God. This is the God who holds all reality together. So essentially, this is the God who says, you can't define me with a name or a statue or a temple. I am beyond those things. I am the thing that holds those things together. And so it's this massive sort of paradigm shift almost of, we have to think about the gods and the divinity and this God in totally different terms than what we're used to. So he says in Exodus, we have this phrase, I am, that is meant to define a God that is beyond the things that we're used to, that again holds all reality together. So that's Exodus 3. Now, if we jump over to Exodus chapter 12, you have a series of events has occurred, and at some point, the Pharaoh or the king has decided it's more trouble than it's worth to hold these people in bondage. I'm going to let them go. And so essentially what happens is the people are told, now you are free. But before you can go, what you have to do is you're going to have a meal together. So there's this final meal before leaving. And it's not just like, hey, it's a long trip, you might want to eat something first. It is this commemorative transition from slavery to freedom. The meal in and of itself has meaning. The meal is a way of saying we are moving out of slavery and into a place of freedom and liberation. So the meal is more than just a meal. It symbolizes freedom. So then in Exodus chapter 12, it says, do not leave any of the food, until morning. If some of it is left until morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. In other words, be ready to move. And so you eat this meal quickly and then go. And then it says, it is the Lord's Passover. So in Exodus, we have a God who refers to God's self as I am, and then we also have a meal that is referred to as Passover. So to this day, Passover is still celebrated. This event is, again, the key defining moment in all of Hebrew history. And so you have this Passover, this meal that is celebrated on the outset of moving towards freedom. So the people are liberated, and they begin to move, and at a certain point, the king changes his mind, and he sends his armies to go and retrieve the people and bring them back to slavery. So at some point, they come up against a sea, and it seems like they're cornered. And so you have the Pharaoh's army coming from one side, and you have this massive sea on the other side, and it becomes a question of, like, well, what are we going to do now? Are we stuck? Are we trapped? Are we without a way out? And so at a certain point in Exodus, I'm jumping ahead. So at a certain point, the sea is parted, and the people are able to cross through the sea towards liberation, and then the waters recede or go back, and then the armies of Pharaoh are drowned in the sea, which is a bit violent, but at the same time, it's this symbol of, the thing that was pursuing us, the thing that was looking to reclaim us and put us into a hostile, destructive, kind of death-oriented space, those things are no longer a threat because we were able to cross the sea without danger. So you have a crossing of a sea in the midst of this. So you have I am, you have a Passover or a meal, and then you have a crossing of a sea. And so in the aftermath of this, there's a moment of celebration. The people, in Exodus 15, verse 1, it says, then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. So essentially, when they realize, we made it across the sea, we're alive and we're free, there's this moment of we're going to stop and we're going to have a moment of celebration. And it says, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he is hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him. My Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, depending on which translation you're looking at. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. So there's lots of language about the things that we were most afraid of going to the bottom of the sea. And it says your right hand, and right hand is often used as language that is like a metaphor for strength or power or some sort of mastery over a thing. So your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. So the image here is you have this group of people who have crossed the sea, and then at the bottom of the sea, you have all the things that were looking to destroy those people, or destroy, or some sort of, or conquer, or capture, or like do something to them that they did not want to have done. So you have this group of people who have crossed a sea after the Passover, and in the shadow of a God who refers to God's self as I am. Okay, so then, in the very next chapter, you have a new situation, a new problem, and the new problem is, okay, well, we didn't love being slaves, but we also don't want to starve to death, and so now we're faced with, because it's very difficult to farm when you're on the run, and so you have this group of people now who are all free, but they're hungry. And so the question becomes, what are we going to do for food now? So at a certain point, God begins to provide food, to provide a certain type of bread that the writers refer to as manna. So in Exodus chapter 16, verse 35, it says, the Israelites ate manna 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. So manna is the thing that sustains the people until they reach the point where they become who they were always meant to be. Manna is the thing that keeps them alive. And so manna becomes this symbolic thing. It becomes a symbolic way of talking about how God provides and protects even in the midst of chaos and fear and confusion. So in the book of Exodus, in the story of Exodus, you have a God who refers to God's self as I am. You have a meal that's referred to as the Passover. You have the crossing of a sea, and then you have God providing in the form of manna. So for thousands of years, this is the story that has defined an entire group of people. To this day, in Jewish theology, this is the most important story in all of Scripture. So now, we're done with the intro. So now we can actually get into the rest of the sermon. So now let's jump over to the book of John and ask the question, okay, when John tells this story about Jesus walking on water, are there any sort of echoes or similarities to the story that we just looked at? So in John chapter 6, verse 3, it says, then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish what was near? The Passover festival. So already in John chapter 6, from the outset, before anything else happens, John is telling us, by the way, Passover is near. John is already framing this story in a certain kind of way. So you have a Passover, and by the way, right after, and there's a whole other, by the way, because we are limited with time in this series, we are going to have to kind of fast forward through one of the 8 miracles in order to make it to Easter on time. And so the miracle that we're not going to have enough time to really dig hard into is where Jesus feeds 5,000 hungry people. But that's where this happens. This happens in John chapter 6. So in John 6, we're told it's the Jewish Passover, and this is immediately followed by Jesus feeding 5,000 hungry people, so which is the 4th miracle in John. So we're told that there's that it's Passover time, and immediately after John tells us it's Passover, Jesus serves a meal to 5,000 people. So we are told it's near Passover, there's a meal served, and then after the meal is served, Jesus' followers decide to cross a sea. So look at John chapter 6, verse 14. This is right after the feeding of the 5,000. Okay, so it says, after the people saw the sign that Jesus performed, the feeding of the 5,000, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who comes into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, which is an odd thing to do to somebody by force, but that's what they wanted to do. And it says, knowing that they intended to come make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, or it's actually not a lake, it's the Sea of Galilee, but the translation says lake. So it says, went down to the lake or to the sea, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake or the sea for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. And they were frightened, because, of course. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. So, let's recap, right? We're told it's Passover. Jesus serves a meal, and then they all cross a sea. By the way, John is not being subtle. He's not at all trying to be vague. His readers know exactly what he's doing at this point. And by the way, where Jesus says, right here in verse 20, it says, it is I, don't be afraid. It is I sounds grammatically correct. In Greek, which is the language that this originally was written in, it's not it is I. It is I is not the actual translation of this. It is, in Greek, it's the phrase ego, eimi. Ego is where we get the word ego. It's a first-person pronoun. And then eimi is a present tense verb, a singular present tense verb. So ego, eimi literally translates as I am. So Jesus, on Passover, serves a meal, crosses the sea, and when there is some amount of fear felt, he tells his followers, don't be afraid, I am. Are you beginning to spot a pattern here? So, it is I am. There is all these echoes calling back to the Exodus story. So then look at John chapter 6, verse 25. It says, so they've reached the other side of the lake. It says, when they found him on the other side, the people who he fed on the other side of the lake, who want to come and make him king by force. It says, when they found him on the other side of the lake, so they've stalked him to the other side of the lake. It says, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? Which is hilarious. They are there because he's there. You know what I mean? Like they're following him over there. It's like knowing you're going to run into somebody, and then when you actually run into them, being like, I had no idea you were going to be here. This is so strange. How did you know this was happening today? But they totally knew he was going to be there. And so they say, Rabbi, when did you get here? Then if you jump to verse 28, it says, then they asked him, what must we do to do the works that God requires? Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. So they asked him, what sign then will you give that we may see it and believe you? To which I would be like, I just fed 5,000 people and then walked on water. Was there more that you were expecting? And so it says, what sign will you give us? What will you do? Our ancestors, watch this, our ancestors ate the what in the wilderness? Ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Jesus said to them, very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And of course, he's referring to himself. Jesus is like, I am the manna. I am the thing that God has provided. So, just to recap, let's take a look. We have in the book of Exodus, we have I am, Passover, crossing a sea, and manna. And in the book of John, chapter 6, we have a Passover followed by a meal, crossing a sea, I am, and manna. John is calling back. He's echoing the story as loudly as he possibly can. So why is he doing this? The entire 6th chapter is a retelling of the Exodus story, but now Jesus is at the center of it. So it's basically Jesus is saying, or John is saying by telling the story, this ancient story about liberation and new life is still your story. The story continues to be told. This is not this ancient story that we are now disconnected from. We are still deeply invested in telling this story. We are still in the Exodus story. Because again, this group of people has been conquered. They have been subjugated. They have been crushed by Rome. And so the question becomes, who even are we now? And John is telling the story like you're the same, you are who you've always been. You're still, the story is still being told. And yeah, it's still difficult and it's still confusing and it's still hard sometimes, but it's still your story. John is telling his readers that Jesus is the new Moses and the whole thing is moving towards new life and liberation. The people who first read John's book and received this in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple and the murder of so many of the people that they probably knew and cared about, this would have been, I would imagine people read this story and wept. There's a new Exodus. Everything is going to change. We are still part of the same story. By the way, John's readers have lost their place of worship. And again, going back to, like, if you lose your temple, like, where, like, are you even connected to a God anymore? And there was real concern that without a physical temple, the people would be disconnected from God. But then Jesus serves the meal outside, not in a temple. The Passover meal is served somewhere just near a body of water, nowhere specific, nowhere near an official house of worship. So what is John trying to say with that? He's saying, you know how you thought the temple was the sacred space? It turns out all the space is sacred. There is no such thing as sacred and non-sacred space. The whole thing is sacred. The whole thing is a part of this story. So all of it is sort of reframing how people thought about identity and God and how we connect with the story that we're all a part of. So let's go back to the walking on the water. Why is that a thing? Like, why not just go across on a boat? So look at John 6, verse 19. It says, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. They were frightened, but he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. So we talked about the I am, it is I part, right? But also the do not be afraid part is pretty significant because it's a powerful thing to say to a group of people who have lived in fear for a very long time. This isn't just about the storm. This is about all the things that the storm represents, all the ways that we've lost ourselves, all the ways that Rome has made us feel terrorized. Like, oh, it is I, don't be afraid. It's not just about crossing the sea, it's about everything. By the way, the sea serves as a pretty powerful metaphor at this time for this group of people because at the time, not just in ancient Jewish consciousness, but in all ancient Near Eastern consciousness, there was this very deeply embedded fear of the sea because the sea represented, for most people, would represent things like chaos and evil and death and the unknown. And I get it. I don't go in the ocean ever at all. I'm terrified of it. Like, I was just talking to somebody about spring break, and they were saying, like, yeah, everybody seems to be going to the beach, like, like senior citizens on their first day of retirement headed to Florida. And so, like, everybody's headed to the beach. And like, to me, that sounds like a bloodbath. Like what the ocean is the scariest place ever. Like, I'm not going down there. And so there's all kinds of things that can, like, eat me or like suck me down and make me drown. Like, I'm terrified of the ocean. I'm not going in. And so, like, this is an ancient fear. Like, I'm in connection with my ancestors by being afraid of the ocean. And so you have this group of people, this ancient society, and everybody's afraid of the sea because there's this notion of, like, whatever's going on under the sea, it is not for us. It is a dark, scary kind of place. Also, by the way, at the time, because it was still a world in which everybody assumed that the earth was flat, there was this notion of a three-tiered view of the whole universe. So the idea was, like, there was no such thing, like, there was no notion of, like, well, there's space and there are these planets, and, like, we didn't have submarines, we didn't have telescopes, and so all we had was what we could see. And so there was this notion that all of reality existed in a three-tier level universe. And so above us, you have the sky, or what people would often refer to as the heavens. And so that's where the gods lived. This is where all the things of divinity and, like, the supernatural occur. Then you have the terrestrial plane, the earth, which is where humans live and thrive and just, like, basically live our lives. And then everything below the earth is where death and chaos and destruction are. We still use language like this, by the way. Like, if you grew up in a church setting and you used, like, afterlife types of language to talk about heaven and hell, and you had, like, imagery of up and down, like, that's very, very old. That comes from a three-tiered view of the universe. And so you have this notion of everything up is good, everything down is bad, and here is just, like, regular. And so, and by the way, notice in the Exodus story, where do the enemies of God end up? They end up at the bottom of the sea, right? Like, in the armies that they're pursuing them, they all end up at the bottom of the sea. This is where death is. And so the idea is whatever is going on below us in the third tier of the universe, like, the sea is seen as, like, a gateway to that space. So to go below the sea is to sort of dabble in chaos and evil and death, and nobody wants to do that. So there was this embedded fear of the sea for all kinds of different cultural and societal kinds of reasons. In fact, in ancient Hebrew poetry, over and over and over again, you see language about, like, the chaos and the unconquerable nature of the sea. So in Psalm 29, this ancient Hebrew poet writes this. He writes, "Ascribe to the Lord, you heavenly beings. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord glory due his name. Worship the Lord in splendor of all his holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders, and the Lord thunders over the mighty waters." This poet is basically saying all the things we are most afraid of, this God is over those things. So the writer is saying this God even has control over the thing that you fear the most. So then in Psalm 33, you have verse 5. It says, "The Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love. By the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, their starry hosts by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses." In other words, the thing that we have no control over, this God stores in jars. Like, it's a juxtaposition of, yeah, we are powerless, but this God has nothing but control over these things that we feel overwhelmed by. And then in Psalm number 69, in verse 13, it says, "But I pray to you, Lord, in the time of your favor, in your great love, O God, answer me with your sure salvation. Rescue me from the mire. Do not let me sink. Deliver me from those who hate me, from the deep waters. Do not let the flood waters engulf me, or the depths swallow me up, or the pit close its mouth over me." So over and we could continue with this for a long time, over and over and over again in ancient Hebrew poetry. And by the way, other cultural texts as well, like have references like this to the seas and to the deep. It's this language of there is something about the sea that is unknowable and unconquerable and terrifying. And you have this language in the Hebrew poets that say this God has some sort of mastery over the thing that we least understand and have the ability to control. So we still, by the way, use language like this. Like, have you ever felt like kind of overwhelmed and said something along the lines of, "I just feel like I'm drowning," or "I'm in way over my head," Or like every once in a while, I've heard people say things like, sometimes I feel like I don't even know which way is up, which is a reference to, because there's sort of famously a notion that like if you're in the ocean and the waves are sort of crashing over your head and you go under, it becomes difficult to find the surface because you've been sort of tossed so many times, you can swim down thinking you're swimming up. So literally like the language of like, I don't know which way is up comes from a reference to possibly drowning in the ocean. So we have this language over and over again, like to this day, about how overwhelmed we feel, a lot of times being used in reference to things like water and the sea. So this goes back very, very far. So in the world of John and the world of Jesus, you have these people who feel overwhelmed and they feel embattled and they feel broken and they feel completely lost in the world. And there's this image of Jesus walking on top of a thing that is not only the thing that they've been afraid of their whole lives, but is in chaos. The waters were rough. So John seems interested in this notion of fear and chaos versus control. So the question becomes for us, as we look at this story, the question becomes, can you at all relate to what it feels like when things are out of control? When you feel like you're in over your head? Can you relate at all to a group of people who felt overwhelmed and helpless? Do you have any sort of notion of what it feels like to just feel like everything is just way out of where I wanted it to be? Yeah, John is really interested in this notion of what do we do when we feel so afraid and so anxious that we don't even know which way is up. Look at John 14, verse 27. This is several chapters later, but it's still in the book of John. And Jesus says this. He says, "Peace I leave with you. My peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid." The writer seems very interested in meeting us in a place of fear and chaos and trying to breathe some sense of peace into it. I am, by nature, a very anxious person. I was an anxious kid. When I was in college, I remember more than once having to go to the hospital because I thought something was wrong with me because I was studying so hard for finals that I actually made myself sick. I remember about 11 years ago, I had a job, and then I lost that job, and that was terrifying, and I didn't know what to do. And just like the amount of like what-if scenarios that go through my head during that period of time. In the world of doing ministry, every once in a while, you'll have people who aren't happy with what you're doing, and they'll say really critical, mean things about you. Or I've never experienced that myself. But rumor has it, people can be very mean if you work in ministry. And so if you're a super anxious person, not necessarily the best profession to go into if you don't want people mad at you a lot. So anyway, I have throughout my life, I've encountered times where it just felt like, oh my gosh, this is so much more than I was prepared for. Like this is so much harder and so much scarier than I could have ever thought it would be. And so I don't know if that's something that is familiar to you. But my assumption is that for a lot of us it is. And so this story of Jesus walking on water is partially about acknowledging all the ways, actually I've never been in control in the first place. Like, yeah, the anxiety is there because I'm trying to control a thing that I could never control. And yeah, I never had the power to control the sea or to stand over it. And so it's also a story about seeing the storm for what it is and choosing not to lose heart, even when it feels like that's the only logical thing to do, even when we feel like the water is going way over our heads. Do you know what it feels like to be overwhelmed or out of control? Because John's readers sure did. And so John tells them a story about a Jesus who serves a meal at Passover and then walks on a raging sea. Several years ago, I was having lunch with a guy who was going through something like this. His parents had just died unexpectedly. He had inherited a business that he wasn't sure if it was how things were going to go, and he was just feeling completely overwhelmed. And he and I were having lunch, and at some point he said, "You know what I want more than anything? A dull moment." And I thought, like, yeah, because at least it wouldn't feel like chaos, right? Like 5 minutes of boredom sounds pretty nice if the whole world feels like a raging sea. How many of us, I wonder, can relate to that feeling and that emotion? So the question becomes, okay, well, then what do you do? Because Jesus says, don't be afraid, to which for those of us who live like the like anxiety default level, like to say to somebody like, well, don't feel anxious. Like, oh, wow, thanks. I hadn't thought of that. You know what I mean? Like, that's not the most helpful thing to say to somebody who's like spiraling into anxiety. Like, well, just don't. Cool. That was the most helpful piece of advice you could have given me in that moment. So that doesn't seem super helpful. So what do we do? How do you process? How do you sort of reframe this in the way that John is trying to invite his readers to do? And so I don't often do the end of a sermon 3 points thing because it feels very Baptist-y, and I'm trying to get away from that. But sometimes it's just there. So we're going to do that. So the first thing I think we're invited to do is name the storm. A lot of times I think we feel overwhelmed because we can't actually name the thing that makes us feel like we just feel anxious and we don't even know why. And so it can be super helpful to just name the thing that's actually making me feel anxious. Like, no, the whole world isn't caving in. I just got a really hostile email from somebody and I'm having some feelings about that. You know what I mean? And so naming the storm often gives perspective. It frames it in a certain kind of way. Also, it's a way of sort of reminding me like, oh, the whole thing isn't this. It's just this one thing that is this. Like, in fact, I was telling somebody between services because we were talking about, like, we were commiserating over like just like chronic anxiety, and I mentioned to him, I said, sometimes I feel anxious over the fact that I don't feel anxious. You know what I mean? Like, I get so worked up about like, why am I not worried about something right now? There must be something I'm not thinking of. That's worrying to me. You know what I mean? And so that's a terrible place to live in your head. And so the thing that helps is just name the storm. Sometimes there is no storm, and I'm just sort of in my own brain. Sometimes it's I had a conflict at work, and it's kind of like, it kind of sent me into a weird space, and now I'm having trouble sort of like finding my footing again. Or sometimes it's something a little bit bigger. Sometimes it's, I got a diagnosis, and it's really scary. Or it's, I have a kid who's making decisions, and they're too old for me to tell them not to make those decisions, and I can see where it's going, and it's nowhere good. You know what I mean? And so that's a storm. Or it's like we are in way over our head financially, and we don't know what we're going to do. Like, there are all kinds of things where the storm actually does feel pretty big. So naming that, though, and being able to like give it like a name and categorize it and put it somewhere is a way of sort of understanding like what the storm is that we're dealing with. So that's one. The second thing is, know that this storm, whatever it is, will probably not last forever, because that's how time works. Things happen, things move on, things become normalized, storms pass. And so this moment is not all moments. This crisis, this struggle, this thing that's overwhelming us, it does not have the last word on your life. So understand, yeah, there is this storm, and yes, it's terrifying, and yes, it's very difficult, but this will not be forever. And so the third thing, and this sounds a little bit trite, but hang with me, is just maybe take a moment to breathe. And when I say breathe, what I mean is like try and center yourself as best you can. Like find a way to have some silence, take some deep breaths, put your feet on the ground. I would, during COVID, I started doing this thing that my therapist encouraged me to do, which, by the way, if you struggle with chronic anxiety, going through a global pandemic, wouldn't advise it. I would not recommend it if you can help it. So, but one of the things that happened was my therapist told me, there are these things that you can do to kind of ground yourself, and one of the things you can do is just sort of start naming the things that you can detect with your senses. Like, what can you see? Like chairs, walls, TV screens, whatever, and things that you can feel. Like, I'm holding a microphone, I'm standing on a platform, there's a music stand. Like, having the ability to sort of remember, like, I am not floating off into space, I'm here in this space at this time. And a lot of times, if you begin to sort of spiral out and the sea begins to sort of feel a little bit rough, that is a really good way of sort of reminding me, like, oh, I am present in this place and in this time, and I am not spinning off the planet like I feel like I'm doing. So, but the thing I hope that we can all internalize and sort of leave remembering is the storm does not have the final word. And the story that we're a part of is actually moving towards grace and peace and liberation and new life. And yeah, it feels scary, and yes, the difficulties are there and the struggles are very real, but they don't have the last word. And when we have a story of Jesus walking on water, it's not just an act of convenience or like a mode of transportation. It is a way of John reminding the people who are reading this, you are not alone. There is a God who has control over the thing that you feel most like disempowered by. The thing that scares you the most is the thing that Jesus says, don't be afraid. I am with you. This moment, this crisis, this event does not have the last word in your life. So may we internalize that. May we move through our lives with a sense of hope, with a sense of peace, with a sense of possible liberation and new beginnings. May we remember that the thing that scares us the most is actually not as out of control as we think that it is. There is something larger. We are a part of something larger than that. And we are invited to remember that even when we are terrified. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you for this image, this beautiful picture of walking on top of a raging sea, of taking control over a thing that feels chaotic and terrifying. And for those of us who are in the middle of a storm, for those of us who feel tossed and overwhelmed and underwater, may we name the thing that is putting us in this place. May we remember that this will not last forever. And may we take deep breaths and ground ourselves in the present, in the here and now. May we find a way to find our footing, even when the sea feels like it's throwing us overboard. May we breathe deeply. May we find comfort. May we find peace. In the name of Jesus, we pray.